So we've had a theme for a few months of bringing it all back home, and we're coming towards the end of that theme now, but we've still got some really important Buddhist concepts to explore. We've been looking at some key Buddhist teachings and then looking at how they can sometimes be distorted over time, and how they need to be translated, but back into their original meaning and also into a form that can be practiced today in our culture, in our times. When we look at the teachings of the Buddha, it's important to remember that they're pointing to a vision which can't be put into words. They're pointing to something beyond words. So Zen Buddhism has a phrase of the teachings of Buddhism are like fingers that are pointing towards a moon. They're trying to point to something beyond those concepts and words. And the danger with us as Buddhists is we can sometimes get obsessed with the finger. We can kind of just see, oh, what a fantastic finger, and forget that it's pointing towards something else. We just get obsessed with the teachings, really, and miss that they're pointing towards something much more magical, mysterious, beyond words. So we need to constantly bear in mind when we hear the Buddhist teachings that they're there to help us grow, to expand our states of consciousness so we can see more clearly, so we can see things as they are. So this evening I'm going to throw out lots of fingers. I'm going to throw out lots of different teachings. I want you to bear in mind that that's what they are. They're to point to something beyond words and concepts. And there's going to be a lot of Dharma input, a lot of ideas. So just relax in a way. Satyajoti said something helpful on a recent retreat when there was a lot of Dharma input. Just let it kind of soak it in. Don't worry about kind of if you don't understand it all. Make notes is helpful, or look back at the video afterwards if you want to revisit parts of it. But I'm going to throw a lot of fingers out this evening. But remember, they're pointing to a moon. That's what they are. So this evening I'm going to look at a really key Buddhist teaching called Anatman, which is written up there, Anatman. And before I explore Anatman, you'll remember that the heart of the Buddha's teaching was the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha described how we suffer, and the cause of suffering is our own craving. And in the Bodhicharyavatara, a writer, a Buddhist called Shantideva, puts this very beautifully for me. He says, well, all the suffering we experience comes from obsession with ourselves. That's another way of putting this craving. It comes from obsession with ourselves. All the suffering in the world comes from obsession with ourselves. Yeah, and the Buddha taught that craving is the root of all suffering. So the teaching of the Buddha of Anatman, the teaching that the Buddha gave of Anatman, is a teaching to undermine this craving and to alleviate suffering. Yeah, and it often gets translated in the West as no self, which I think is unfortunate, and I'll explore that in a little while. It can lead to some distortions. But simply it means no Atman, which might not make it any much clearer. But An means no, and Atman is a particular term with a particular meaning. It comes from the Vedic tradition, which is what we now know as Hinduism, and it's got a very particular meaning. So Atman is one of those words we don't have an equivalent to in English, so it's probably better not to translate it. But the meaning is along the lines of Atman is an essential nature. It's the belief that there's something about us that is me, that's something about me that is me, and it's separate from the world out there, and it doesn't change. I've got this kind of essential me-ness inside, and it's separate from the world outside, and it doesn't change. That's Atman, that's what Atman is. And the Buddha very clearly was around at the time this idea was around and said, no, there's no Atman, and he gave teachings to help us undermine this view of Atman. So it's a very old Vedic teaching, Atman. And Anatman directly talks to that, kind of counters that. But if we examine our own experience ourselves in meditation or in study groups or in reflection or with ethics, you'll find that we also have a very strong intuitive belief in and sense of a separate self that's fixed, doesn't change, and is separate from the world around us. We have a similar belief in something like Atman. And there's at least two implications of this belief in Atman. There are probably more, but I could think of two important ones today. And the first implication, if you believe that you exist separately from the world around you, then the route to happiness is pursuing your own needs, and it doesn't matter about other people. It leads to selfishness. selfish craving, and this is what we've just heard is the root of all suffering. So it's a very pernicious and kind of dangerous view, this belief in a separate self. But also, if you believe that you've got something about you that can't change, that is fixed, well, that really undermines the belief in karma. So it really undermines the belief that we can change. It leads to us kind of being demoralised, this kind of limited view of ourselves. I can't change, it's no use. And I think you might have familiar experiences, familiar kind of thought patterns where it's no use, I can't change. I'm always going to be this way, I'm always going to respond like that. Even if it's kind of just below the surface, this kind of view, it undermines us, it undermines our practice. Yeah, and we end up living with a very kind of limited idea of ourselves, just on the surface of our experience. We don't act from our deep potential. But once we see through this limited idea of a kind of fixed, separate self, it's like we're freed from a shackle, freed from a prison. Our consciousness becomes freed. We're free from a prison that kind of cuts us off from reality. So we see the true nature of reality. We see how things really are. And as you expect, Buddhism has a word for the true nature of reality. It's shunyata, which I've also written up here. And as you'd also expect, it's not a great translation. The translation we have into English is emptiness. And similar to Anatman, it's not a very particularly helpful translation, emptiness. Because it can lead to a sense of maybe like there's nothing or there's a kind of voidness, and that's definitely not what reality is. So shunyata, I mean, if it's empty at all, the way I would relate to it, it's empty of all our ideas about it. We have kind of limited ideas about ourselves and reality is completely empty of those ideas. It's nothing to do with those ideas. And a better word for shunyata, a better translation is mystery. So it's almost like, reality is mysterious. It's deeply mysterious and profound. We can't understand it. So that's what, in a sense, that's what Buddhist wisdom is pointing towards. That's what the fingers are pointing towards, something that's mysterious and deep, can't really be put into concepts. So, this experience of being freed from this shackle, this kind of prison of a limited view of ourselves, and being open to the true nature of reality is usually called insight or vipassana in Buddhist tradition. And in Triratna we call it spiritual death. We call this aspect, this stage of practice, spiritual death. Because the experience of shunyata can feel very much like the death of who we are now. It's a death of a limited view of ourselves, and therefore we can experience great fear, really strong fear in relation to spiritual death, insight. Sangharakshita in his memoirs talks about years of just feeling intense fear in his practice, and he described it as the breath of shunyata in his experience. Years of great fear. But the other side of this is great bliss. The release, the release of our consciousness, the liberation, great bliss, the unfolding of new qualities, Buddha qualities. So this is the aspect of spiritual rebirth, and these two come together, the kind of death of this limited version of ourselves and the birth, the rebirth of something fantastic, mysterious, kind of, unlimited bliss. So the Buddha taught reflection and meditation practices to try and look for Atman in our experience and to not find it anywhere, to try and undermine this view of Atman. And these are called insight practices, vipassana practices. We would call them spiritual death practices in Triratna. And like so many other practices and teachings we've looked at in this series, there's real danger of this being distorted, the teaching of Anatman being distorted. Especially when it's translated as no self, which it usually is. So also, especially when it's practiced by ourselves in our current conditions, our current culture. So we haven't got a Vedic religion in our time, but we've got the religion of consumerism and the religion of scientific materialism. So I'll explore those later. We've got particular pitfalls that we could encounter with our approach to Anatman, to spiritual death. So, I'm going to explore that with you, but first, as well as sometimes teaching in terms of no self, Anatman, it'd be just as true to say that the Buddha taught about developing a strong self. There's loads of teachings in the Pali Canon and elsewhere where the Buddha talks about, in terms of developing a really strong self. So it'd be just as true to say the Buddha taught develop a strong self. So that in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, make yourself an island of yourself, which no flood can overwhelm. So you're going to just develop this really strong self that can't be overwhelmed by samsara. He also uses a metaphor of make yourself into a mountain that can't be blown about by praise and blame and loss and gain, the worldly winds. So make yourself into a big mountain or an island. So he used a lot of imagery in terms of developing the self, a strong self. And he gave practices like ethics, meditation, which are all about developing a stronger self. So which is it? Which is true? Which is it? Is it no self or is it a stronger self? And that's the title that I've been given this evening to explore, strong self or no self. So a metaphor for the Dharma life is a great journey. We're embarking on, you may not realise it, but you have embarked on a great journey. And it involves a great deal of transformation. And at times it's very difficult, but it's hugely rewarding. And when you think about it, for me, it's the only meaningful thing to do with a human life. So it's the journey. For this, that's the way I relate to it. And Sangharakshita has signposted this journey for us into 5 stages, which are called 5 stages of the path. So before we can embark on these insight practices, the stage of spiritual death and rebirth that we've been looking at, there's a great deal of preparation to do. We're embarking on a long journey, and this journey begins with cultivating, developing a stronger self. A self that can be a better help to the world. So the first stages of this great journey are integration and positive emotion. And Sangharakshita spoke in these stages in terms of cultivating a happy, healthy human state. You could say becoming a strong self, becoming a happy, healthy human being. So let's explore this first stage, integration. So when we begin the spiritual path, the Dharma life, as I've already said, we're eventually aiming to become unshackled from a limited view of ourselves. But to begin with, that limited view of ourselves isn't even consistent. In different situations, we have a different experience of ourselves. We have a different view of ourselves in different conditions, in different situations. So it'd be truer to speak not of seeing through oneself, but to speak in terms of seeing through ourselves. It's as though we've got lots and lots of different conflicting, competing selves. And first of all, we need to bring those into view, into clear view. This is the stage of integration. To see through ourselves, first of all, we need to get to know ourselves more deeply, or get to know ourselves more deeply. And to begin with, we're completely unaware of the competing drives and emotions within us. They're like blind spots. They can be really obvious to our friends and our relations, but to us, we don't realise some of the ways that we are, some of the emotions that we have, some of our drives. So with awareness and mindfulness, we bring into view all these different aspects of ourselves. The Buddhist path involves transforming all of ourselves, the total transformation of the heights and the depths, Sangharakshita calls it. So I'm going to do a drawing on one of these flip charts I forgot to do earlier. I'm going to do that now, a little bit of arts for you. Oh no, where am I going to do it? That's all falling apart. So here's my drawing. So this is our self. And it's a bit like an iceberg, and basically there's this sense that we're just aware of a small part of ourselves, a really limited part of ourselves. So much of our kind of being, our emotions, our drives, our volitions are just below the surface of our awareness. And this is a diagram I picked up from Vedanya, which relates to the Yogacara school of Buddhism. And actually, the truth of spiritual death and rebirth, the truth of the spiritual path, is that we're actually not separate self, as I said earlier. So we're kind of there's waves of other selves around us, and we have this sense of being cut off and isolated. But the deeper we go into reality and into ourselves, like below the surface of this separateness, we're deeply connected. And that's the kind of truth, that's the truth of Shunyata. Below all this separateness, we're deeply connected. But to begin with, we've got this kind of very limited sense of ourselves up here, this kind of very small fraction of ourselves that we're aware of. And we need to really bring the whole of ourselves into view, into awareness. Before we can engage with spiritual death and rebirth, we need to become an integrated individual. We need to become more consistent. And we need to bring all these different parts of ourselves into dialogue with each other. So this first stage of integration, going back here, that's unfortunate, isn't it? What shall I do? Some bit of, there we are, thank you, my traversing. Yeah. So the way we become integrated, actually, is we commit to living by a higher ideal, that we can gather all the different parts of ourselves around. And we can kind of integrate around this in all the different areas of our lives, so we can become consistent, a consistent self. There's no point trying to kind of see through ourselves if we're just completely random, dissipated, different selves in different situations. We need to be a consistent individual before we can even think about trying to see through that. Yeah, so we need to know ourselves. I don't know where this comes from. This phrase came to mind of know thyself. It probably comes from a philosopher. I don't know where it comes from, but it's really important. You need to really know yourself. Yeah. So when somebody does this, when I've encountered people on the Buddhist path for a number of years now, and you can tell when somebody starts to do this, when they bring different parts of themselves into relation, into awareness, they have more of an impact. They've got a greater presence about them. When someone's in relation to all the different aspects of their being, both the skillful and the unskillful aspects of themselves, it's like they're a bigger person. There's a maturity about them, a depth to them. And it'd be true to say that they have a stronger self. You can really feel their presence there. They have an impact. They're more effective. They get things done. People are reliable, consistent when they've integrated all these different competing, conflicting parts of themselves. So we need to begin by becoming a strong self, an integrated strong self. And this is a gradual process. Sometimes it's a painful process. It takes many, many, many years of dedicated practice, meditation, ethics, study. It's a gradual path. The Buddhist path is a gradual path with regular steps to it. And we heard about a sutta last week that Dharma Maya talked about the taste of freedom, the Buddha comparing the Dharma life to like a great ocean. And one of the verses, one of the comparisons he makes is that the great ocean has a bed, the kind of ocean bed just gradually deepens, really imperceptibly gets deeper and deeper. There's no sudden drop off. It just gradually deepens. And he says in the same way, the Dharma life, it just gets gradually deeper. You could see yourself as starting off paddling, and then you're up to your knees, and then you're swimming in the ocean, and before you know it, you're much deeper than you started off. It's a gradual deepening. And the Buddha said there's no kind of sharp drop-off into insight. It's a gradual deepening into spiritual death. But that doesn't sit well in our culture, in our age. We live in the age of consumerism. And we don't want all that pain. We don't want to wait all that time. We're used to getting things tomorrow. We're used to Amazon Prime. We can get things today. We can get things tomorrow before 12 if we order before 3 o'clock. So we want a quick fix. We're used to a quick fix. We want that. We're used to that. There's an inbuilt kind of view and attitude in our society of, well, why bother waiting? Let's look for the quick way. There must be a quick way. Let's get enlightenment tomorrow. Let's get it this weekend. But beware something that offers you a technique to insight that you can do easily and quickly, and beware of that. I watched a video when Sangharakshita died a few weeks ago. I watched a short film that was made, I don't know, a few decades ago. It's called The Enlightened Englishman, and it was a kind of documentary about him. And there's a phrase that really struck me. Sangharakshita said that he'd found the spiritual life difficult at all stages. He said it had been difficult for him at all stages. He said maybe it had been more easier for him than some of his friends that he'd known, but it's been difficult at all stages. And he was kind of pointing out the pitfalls of, he said that sometimes we think that we're offered a panacea, a quick solution. He talked about courses offering enlightenment in a weekend, and you get a certificate saying you're enlightened in a weekend. So this can be really enticing, really attractive, a quick fix to enlightenment, but beware that. We want enlightenment now. We want to go straight to spiritual death, straight to insight, straight to vipassana. But it's dangerous. That's dangerous. And the danger is that you'll end up with a simplistic, rational understanding, and you'll mistake a kind of superficial understanding for insight. You'll mistake that as being wisdom or insight. Anatman's easy. It's an easy concept. I know I'm not fixed. I know I'm not separate. I've got it. I've done it. And you can kind of convince yourself that you're enlightened or like the Buddha, but you've not really transformed at all. So going back to my piece of art, my work of art, if you've not undergone this transformation, you can just kind of end up just being trapped in a kind of superficial experience of yourself, kind of maybe seeing through a superficial version of yourself, but there's been no transformation's taken place. You're alienated, not only cut off from other people, but you're cut off from yourself, cut off from your emotions and a deeper experience of yourself. You just end up, and I've met people like this, unfortunately, who think that they have attained something on the spiritual path, but really they just seem to be cut off from me and their emotions, unfortunately. So it's a danger. Beware of this in our culture, consumerism. We want a quick fix. Sorry, I've got moving around all over the place. I've got a sheet here with the dangers of Anatman. The dangers of no self. Just beware something that offers you a technique with a quick path to insight, because it's probably going to be a dead end. An even more dangerous, perhaps, pitfall of no self, the doctrine of Anatman, is our culture of nihilism in our society. So very briefly, we have there's an underlying view in society of scientific materialism. I'm just going to very briefly try and explain what that is, so hopefully it'll create a picture for you. But it's a sense that nothing is really true or exists unless it can be measured or proven empirically. So it rules out things like a spiritual life, higher values. In the end, kind of nothing really matters. And the aim of life just becomes get as much pleasure as you can before you die. This is a kind of like a nihilistic approach to life that kind of underpins a lot of attitudes of kind of hedonism and pleasure seeking in our society, distraction. There's no point to life, let's just distract ourselves and have as much pleasure as possible. And if we translate Anatman as no self and take that to be literally true, a kind of metaphysical vision, and people do this, it has very dangerous consequences. That would mean literally that we don't exist, that you or I don't exist, which is plainly not true and a bit ridiculous. It kind of feeds into our nihilistic perspective and interpretations. So we do have a self. We have a self. I have a self. You have a self. But it's very, very different from the kind of self we think we have and experience that we have. It's not true. It'd be misleading to say we have no self at all, which kind of is often how an Anatman can be presented. We have a self that is constantly changing and deeply affected by, conditioned by, connected with the world around us. And even the words I'm using, the concepts I'm using to describe it, aren't the same as shunyata or Anatman. They're kind of a way of trying to point towards it. Remember that they're all fingers pointing to something. So the danger is that we want a shortcut to enlightenment, and we misunderstand that it means nothing exists or no self. No self exists. So I'll tell you why this is dangerous. And I've met people with these views, and they're dangerous views. Nothing to do with Buddhism. And there's a really great teacher of shunyata called Nagarjuna from the 3rd century, and he said it's better to have a sense of self. He taught shunyata, but he said it's better to have a sense of self the size of Mount Meru than to get the wrong understanding of shunyata, than to have a nihilistic understanding of shunyata. It's better to have a sense. It'd be much better, even this would be harmful, but it'd be much better to have a sense of ego and self to be as big as a mountain than to misunderstand this teaching. So one implication, if you think there's no self and you don't exist, which some Buddhists do, then you don't exist, and neither do your emotions. So a friend of mine went through a process of focusing intensely on no self and being mentored through this. And he started to experience terrible anxiety, really, really terrible anxiety for about a year. And the advice he was given is, well, there's nobody experiencing the anxiety, so it doesn't matter. And in a way, the anxiety doesn't exist, so it doesn't matter. And it just got worse and worse, and just this terrible anxiety. And what he needed really was the earlier stages of the practice, integration and positive emotion. So it's very, very dangerous to have this teaching of no self. But it's really convenient to think that there isn't a self and there's no emotions, because that means we don't have to bother with all those kind of pesky, painful emotions, all that transformation. We don't need to bother with that because it doesn't exist. It's really convenient. But actually, enlightenment involves a transformation of the heights and the depth, the total transformation. So in this stage of integration, this first stage of integration, as well as gathering ourselves, parts of ourselves together, it also means we turn towards our emotions in integration. We turn towards and experience our emotions. We don't take them too seriously. We befriend them, we turn towards them, we acknowledge them, we acknowledge all the different emotions that we have. The painful ones, the skillful ones, the unskillful ones, and we take responsibility for them. This is what it means to become more of an individual, a person who has more presence, more integrity. We take responsibility for our emotions, we admit to them, we confess them to our friends. Actually, yes, I do experience tremendous rage, I experience hatred, I experience really embarrassing sexual craving. Admitting that all of that to your friends, just taking responsibility for that, owning up to it. So that's the stage of integration. Gathering the parts of ourselves together, really turning towards our emotions, so we don't end up in this kind of alienated state of misunderstanding, kind of superficial understanding. Okay. And then one other danger of nihilism and this idea of Anatman as being no self, which again I've encountered Buddhists and come across Buddhists with this view, is that if there's no self, I don't exist, and therefore there's no one being unethical, so karma doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about karma because there's nobody being unethical. There's no such thing as being unethical. That's a really, really dangerous idea, and it's completely un-Buddhist. It's not a Buddhist idea at all. So this brings us into the stage of positive emotion, the importance of positive emotion. It means taking responsibility for our karma and our ethics. All the ways that our self-obsession, our craving manifests as unskillful behaviour, our craving and aversion, the negative precepts. It means cultivating metta and the metta bhavana. It means training and redirecting our emotions and our views, cultivating the positive precepts. It means friendship. It means metta bhavana. So we really need to harness our emotions, and we need to take responsibility for our ethical actions and choices. This is a stage of positive emotion. So we really are becoming a kind of more mature, integrated, positive individual that has a real impact on the world. This is really important stages of the spiritual life that can't be bypassed. So ultimately with Anatman, with this sense of Anatman, we're trying to remove these false views, these views that shackle us, that limit us, that imprison us. We're trying to unpick and remove these views. But the views aren't just ideas, they're not just concepts. The views go very deep. There's an emotional and volitional aspect to them. So if we don't engage our emotions, we're going to end up mistaking a kind of rational, conceptual understanding of the teachings as being wisdom. It's not wisdom. Wisdom involves emotional understanding as well. So the concepts, the teaching of Buddhism, remember I keep coming back to this teaching, they're a finger pointing at a moon, something beyond the teachings. So we can't take them too literally. The intellectual understanding of those concepts is important. But Sangharakshita said a really important aphorism is we need to find emotional equivalents to our intellectual understandings. We need to find emotional equivalents to our intellectual understandings. So what does this mean? I'll unpack a little bit from my experience what this has meant for me. And maybe in the last kind of couple of years, this is what it's meant for me. So the idea of dukkha, you'll have come across the idea of unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, suffering. In a sense, it's quite an easy idea to get. Intellectually, it's not difficult to understand that. But I had a spell of maybe about 6 months of, I just became more and more aware of dukkha in my life. It's like I was being pummeled by dukkha. The universe was pummeling me with dukkha. And I just had the sense of this, I need to get this, otherwise I'm going to keep continually getting battered by dukkha. It felt like something was trying to break through. It's just like one thing, it seemed to be one thing after another would just be really unsatisfactory. Moved house, lots of things went wrong. The cat went up a chimney. I mean, there's kind of small things, but my car broke down, my wife's car broke down all at the same time. My kids got norovirus, I got norovirus. Just one thing after another. I just had this constant experience of just kind of being let down, not being able to go on retreats that I wanted to go on. It just seemed like I was constantly being disappointed, and in a way, I got a real emotional sense of what dukkha means. It's really painful, experience of suffering. This is what suffering is. This is what unsatisfactoriness is. And it just led to a deeper understanding of the teaching of dukkha. So we need to be looking out for this all the time. Can we experience the emotional equivalent of these ideas in our life? And then it brings them alive, it brings them deeper. We get a deeper understanding of them. And similarly, the concept of impermanence is very easy to understand, isn't it, really? It's very easy to grasp. Everything changes. It's not difficult to understand that intellectually. But it also means everything ceases to exist as well. And that includes everything you love, everybody you love. It includes you. And maybe in the last 8 months, 4 people have died that I've been close to. And that has been obviously very painful. And it had a real deeper seeing of impermanence. Like, this is what impermanence means. Like, I'm going to die. Everybody's going to die. My loved ones are going to die. This is the emotional equivalent of that teaching. Like, on the surface, it's just quite a nice idea, isn't it? And it is a very positive idea as well, of transformation, of change. But there's a real deep, emotional significance to this. Where am I? Okay, so we need emotional equivalents of intellectual understanding. So I want to take that in relation to Anatman. What would be, so we've got this idea of Atman, this idea we've got a fixed self, an unchanging self. What would the emotional equivalent of that be, this wrong view? What would that look like? So if we've got this view of a fixed self that's not changing, a separate self, cut off from the world, what would the emotional equivalent of that be? What would that feel like emotionally? You need to get to know that. Then you can recognize it, really feel it, and become fed up with it. Become fed up with what that feels like, and then you'll want to move away from it. You'll want to abandon that idea. So what is it? What does it feel like? What is the emotional equivalent of Atman? It's selfishness, selfish tendencies. It's selfish craving, grasping. And poetically, we sometimes speak of this as ego clinging. It's like our ego clinging onto things, trying to feed itself, make it feel more secure, more stronger. Our ego is desperate. Really, it's quite sad, actually. We're kind of, this part of us is just very, very desperate to make itself feel more secure. So we cling after pleasure, possessions, consume things, like trying to make ourselves feel more important than other people. It's our ego trying to act in a way that reinforces itself, makes this view seem more secure. And yeah, it's not a thing like Atman or ego clinging. It's not like a noun. It's not a thing. It's more like an activity. It's a verb. It's something that we're involved in, that we do. And you need to notice when you're doing it what it feels like. Notice that it's painful, and then do it less. Just become fed up with it and do it less and less. So they're going to get the punchline. They're going to get the kind of big finish. So that's good. We'll let them. We'll come in. Let's take the opportunity to have a drink. Yeah, so the emotional equivalent of this fixed view about yourself is ego clinging. And a real classic sign of this in ourselves and other people around us is conceit. So this is the kind of third pitfall of no self. Conceit means we kind of desperately want to know our position in the hierarchy of things. It's like it gives us a sense of almost like security within the group, within the overall scheme of things. Where do I fit in? And so conceit can either be feeling superior to somebody else, or it can mean feeling inferior to somebody else, or it can be feeling the same as yourself. I'm the same as other people. It's any activity of kind of comparing yourself to other people and wanting to know where you fit in. It's this tendency to want to shore up the sense of being separate and kind of where you fit into everything. And yeah, if you've got this sense of you focusing on trying to see through no self, it's like you trying to see through no self. The danger is that this becomes an obsession. It's an obsession of you trying to see through yourself, and it gets hijacked. This activity, this pursuit of insight gets hijacked by this underlying conceit and self-obsession. So, yeah, particularly if you're not engaged in this kind of deeper practice of emotional engagement. So like every other activity in our life, spiritual death and insight becomes about me. It becomes all about me, which is completely not what it's supposed to be about. So it becomes all about my attainment, my insight, how clever and wise I am to have seen through myself that doesn't exist. Actually, it's like a massive blind spot. Without realizing it, what you're actually doing is feeding your sense of importance, your kind of sense of conceit. I've attained something, I'm much better than everybody else. So that's a real danger of trying to kind of see through no self, is it ends up being all about yourself and kind of how wise and how kind of, how much insight you've got at your attainment. So there's another link here to the importance of positive emotion. In a way, you could see the integration of positive emotion as being creating the appropriate foundation for spiritual death, for insight practice. If you don't have these foundations in place, you're going to get lost, you're going to go wrong. You need these foundations in place. So positive emotion is a foundation for insight. It's about cultivating concern for other people, metta. So rather than being this tendency, it undermines this tendency to be obsessed about ourselves. So when you get to engaging with spiritual death, it's not going to be about a self-obsession. It's not going to be about another thing that's about me. You need to really cultivate this trend within yourself of caring for the people, of metta, kindness. So Sangharakshita has advised, I wouldn't say advised isn't the right word, but in a seminar when he looked at wisdom, and it's been made into a book called Living Wisely, there's a reference where he says it's far better, he recommends for us, it's far better not to think in terms of trying to see through and know self, but to think more in terms of expanding your sense of self. Have a sense of self that just becomes bigger and bigger and includes more people. So your sense of who you identify with and who you care about isn't just limited to yourself. You begin to care about not only yourself, but your friends and then strangers and then everybody. So you can see how the metta bhavana actually can be an insight practice. You start to, you're not just concerned about yourself, you become concerned about everybody. Okay. So, if that's the emotional equivalent of Atman, what would be the emotional equivalent to Anatman? Seeing through this fixed and independent self. So I've got some thoughts. So if you see through an Atman and you can see through to the deeply mysterious nature of reality, well then the emotional equivalent to that would be reverence and awe. You would experience reverence and awe in relation to this deeply mysterious reality. So that would be the emotional equivalent, reverence and awe. And if you see that you're deeply connected to the world around you, you're not separate, but you're deeply connected to the world around you, the emotional equivalent to that would be metta. It would be love. It would be compassion. It would be mudita, joy in the success of other people. That would be the emotional equivalent to that. But rather than seeing yourself as being separate, if you see yourself as deeply connected, that would be the emotional equivalent. And if you see how little control you have over your circumstances and how much you rely on other people around you, then the emotional equivalent to that would be gratitude. You would experience deep gratitude to everybody for all the ways in which they help you. That would be an emotional equivalent. And if you see how foolish this grasping after kind of a separate fixed self, this limited identity, if you see how foolish some of our behaviour is in relation to that and continues to be, the emotional equivalent to that would be humility. You'd be humbled by that. It wouldn't be conceit, it would be humility. So positive emotion integration are preparations, are foundations for insight, spiritual death. And they're about cultivating a strong sense of self. And that which cares about other people. So you can reduce ego clinging, you can reduce self-obsession by cultivating metta, by focusing on other people, by the positive precepts, by altruistic activity, by serving other people. Basically by doing what Maitri-Varsin does. They're all the things that Maitri-Varsin does. And I was really struck, Padmavajra, I was at Padmaloka last week, and in a talk Padmavajra said, well, shunyata, which gets translated as emptiness, actually one way of interpreting that is the emptiness of this distinction between self and other. So it's the emptiness of the distinction between you and other people, the world out there. That kind of disintegrates. You just connect with other people and care for them as if you were caring for yourself. So I think at the start, a while ago, at the start I mentioned about Shantideva. Shantideva had this verse, all the suffering in the world comes from obsession with ourself. The other side of that verse, the end of that verse, is all the joy in the world comes from focusing on the happiness of other people. So all the suffering in the world comes from obsession with ourself. All the joy in the world comes from focusing on the happiness of others. So, yeah, there's a myth, there's a kind of way, there's an ideal, there's a way of relating to the world which underpins Shantideva's very, very important text, the Bodhicharyavatara. We're going to hear more about this next week in Mokshitara's talk. But it's called the Bodhisattva ideal. Hopefully most of you will be familiar with the Bodhisattva ideal, but if not, there's a really great lecture series that Sangharakshita gave in the 60s called the Bodhisattva ideal. It's been made into a book, which you can get in the bookshop. And Subhuti gave some amazing lectures on this at Padmaloka last year. So the Bodhisattva ideal. What is the Bodhisattva ideal? So you might be familiar with the term Bodhisattva, maybe more as like an archetypal embodiment of the enlightened mind, the Buddha qualities. So that is a Bodhisattva, an enlightened, an archetypal depiction of the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind. But a Bodhisattva can also be a human being who aspires to and begins to embody those qualities, begins to embody the enlightened mind, the bodhicitta. And Mokshitara is going to unpack this more next week. But this aspiration to kind of develop these qualities can become a whole way of life. It can just become the whole direction of our life, the ideal that we live for and we live by. So, and the Bodhisattva ideal is very much concerned with developing a stronger self. The Bodhisattva develops themselves. There's 6 paramitas called the 6 perfections, and it's generosity, ethics, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. So the Bodhisattva is developing themselves. They're creating a really strong self. They've got a big self, a strong self, and there's this big-hearted love of a Bodhisattva called Maha Maitri, the great love. The Bodhisattva is trying to develop Maha Maitri, the great love. And at the same time as developing this really strong self that has a really beneficial impact on the world, the whole motivation is to do this for the benefit of other people. And this completely undermines this danger of self-inflation, self-obsession. So you're focusing on others, your practice is focused on serving other people. You're developing a really strong self, but for the benefit of other people. I've heard it talked about in terms of bending the straw the other way. So the straw is bent completely towards being obsessed with ourselves. And we need to bend it towards being obsessed with other people, caring for other people. And we might end up with more of a straight straw than a bendy straw. So it's a win-win situation. If you're kind and generous to other people, it makes them happy. But it makes you happy as well. Shantideva said, this is where all the joy in the world comes from, making other people happy. So everyone is a winner. I was tempted to sing and play air guitar that way, but everyone is a winner, baby. That's the truth. I shouldn't have done that. I regret doing that. Yeah, but it makes you happy. If you're kinder and more generous, it makes other people happier and it makes you happier. So everybody wins. And it undermines your sense of self, your sense of separate self. It weakens your ego clinging. It makes you wiser. So everybody wins. And also, identifying as part of a community is also a way of undermining obsession with yourself. So you can move from having this kind of limited, we've got this alienated experience of ourselves and a more, deeper sense of ourselves. But actually, if you start to feel more deeply connected to other people, you can identify as being part of something bigger, part of a sangha, part of a community. And that is an intermediate stage in spiritual death. It's like you no longer identify your life as being about yourself. You live for and as part of a community, connected with other people. So, basically the punchline of the whole talk is that we need both a strong self and no self. We need to both become bigger, stronger beings with more capacity, more capable to help other people, but also we need to become humbler, more humble, less interested in ourselves, more interested in other people, more selfless. So my experience of people I've met in the True Ratna community who are more experienced than myself, who've practiced more intensely than I have and I do, is that they're very, very big, strong individuals, really big people. And it's not at all my experience would be to say that they don't exist. That would just seem absurd. But they've got a real sense of themselves, the impact that the decisions that they make have on other people. They have a real presence, a real weight, a real impact. But they're not conceited in any way. They're really aware of their own limitations. Very humble people. They really weaken this sense of self-inflation. And they're not interested in being seen as wise or attained. They're not interested in the opinions of other people, or praise or blame. But they're deeply kind and compassionate, caring people. They really undermine this sense of self-obsession, and they deeply care about other people. They care more for me than I care for myself. And they act selflessly. These are people that I've encountered that I'm really impressed by. And I'd also say it's as though, as well as being a really strong individual or self, it's as though there's something about them that isn't them, that's not them. Something mysterious that they seem to be in touch with or inspired by or connected with or in communion with. These people that impress me, it's as though there's something bigger than just themselves. They're more than just an individual. So, you can become an individual to start with. You can become a connected individual. But I've met people who it's very obviously they're more than just that. There's something that they're in touch with, that they're inspired by, that you can pick up on about them. They're more than just an individual. Yeah, so perhaps if we're going to speak in terms of a self at all, maybe it's better just to speak in terms of getting ourselves out of the way so that something bigger can manifest through us, can act through us. And getting ourselves out of the way isn't a self-conscious act. It just comes naturally from years of devoting oneself, developing oneself for the benefit of other people, persistently working on your own ethics, emotions, views, meditation, on serving other people. And this becomes, it flowers into even a pure selflessness, a spontaneous, compassionate activity, which is the final stage of Sangharakshita's 5 stages. So this activity, this selfless activity, flowers into spontaneous, compassionate activity. The Bodhisattva reaches the point when their practice of developing a strong self, the paramitas, has become perfected. And it becomes perfected when it's infused with shunyata. It's infused with shunyata. This is the culmination of the path. The Bodhisattva is now acting with pure selflessness, spontaneous, compassionate activity. And this is the state of a very, very substantial being making a real impact on the world, an extremely strong self, acting with pure selflessness. It's a spontaneous compassion. And maybe it's best summed up in poetry. So I'll just end by reading a short poem by Sangharakshita called The Unseen Flower. Compassion is far more than emotion. It is something that springs up in the emptiness, which is when you yourself are not there, so that you do not know anything about it. Nobody, in fact, knows anything about it. If they knew it, it would not be compassion. But they can only smell the scent of the unseen flower that blooms in the heart of the void. I'm going to read that again. The unseen flower. Compassion is far more than emotion. It is something that springs up in the emptiness, which is when you yourself are not there, so that you do not know anything about it. Nobody, in fact, knows anything about it. If they knew it, it would not be compassion. But they can only smell the scent of the unseen flower that blooms in the heart of the void.